The blood-red sun cast long shadows across Nebraska City's dirt-strewn Main Street as Sarah Gentry clutched her 6-month-old daughter closer to her chest, the whispers following her like vengeful ghosts. The year was 1876, and in this unforgiving Nebraska frontier town, a woman with a child and no husband might as well have been wearing a scarlet letter. "Harlot," someone hissed as she hurried past the general store, her threadbare shawl providing little protection against the autumn chill or the cold stares of townsfolk who had once greeted her warmly. Just 18 months ago, she had been the respectable 20-year-old daughter of the town's doctor. Now, at 21, she was an outcast. Sarah kept her eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to notice as Mrs. Patterson gathered her young daughters closer, as if Sarah's fallen status might be contagious. Little Emma stirred against her chest, and Sarah adjusted the thin blanket to shield her daughter's face from prying eyes. The child was innocent, yet Nebraska City had decided she too would bear the weight of her mother's supposed sin. "You need anything else today, Miss Gentry?" Mr. Thompson, the grocer, asked stiffly when she approached his counter with her meager purchases, a small sack of flour and some beans that would have to stretch for days. "No, thank you," Sarah replied softly, placing her coins on the counter. She noticed how he avoided touching her hand when he slid her change across the worn wooden surface. Once, she'd been welcomed in every home in Nebraska City. Her father, Dr. William Gentry, had been respected throughout the county. But 8 months ago, influenza had taken him suddenly, leaving Sarah alone and with child. The father of her baby, a smooth, talking salesman who had promised marriage before disappearing west, had never returned. The town's sympathy had quickly soured to judgment. "You shouldn't come in during busy hours," Thompson said, glancing nervously at his other customers. "Perhaps send a list next time and I can have a boy deliver your goods." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "I have the same right to shop as anyone else." "Of course," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Just thinking of your comfort," her comfort. As if being treated like a leper could ever be comfortable. Sarah gathered her purchases and stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, blinking back tears that threatened to spill. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The boarding house where she now lived, the only one that would take her, and sat at the edge of town, a dilapidated 2-story structure that had seen better days. Mrs. Winters, the elderly widow who owned it, had only agreed to rent to Sarah because she needed the money, and because she'd known Sarah's mother before consumption took her a decade ago. Sarah had nearly reached the relative safety of the boarding house when she heard the commotion. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, their horses kicking up dust as they dismounted in front of the saloon. She kept her head down, walking faster. Cowboys meant trouble, drinking, fighting, and sometimes worse for women they deemed available. "Whoa there, boy!" A deep voice called out as one of the horses broke free, galloping straight toward Sarah. She froze, clutching Emma tighter as the massive animal bore down on them. In an instant, a tall figure stepped between Sarah and the charging horse, hand raised. "Easy now," the man said in a calm, authoritative voice. The horse slowed, snorting and stamping as the stranger caught its reins. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she looked up at her rescuer. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean build beneath a dust-covered denim shirt and worn leather vest. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, revealed striking blue eyes that studied her with unexpected gentleness. "You all right, madam?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Yes," Sarah managed, adjusting Emma, who had started to fuss. "Thank you." The man's eyes moved to the bundle in her arms, and Sarah tensed, waiting for the judgment to flash across his face. Instead, he smiled a genuine smile that reached those blue eyes. "That's a mighty fine little one you got there," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Zachary Young. Most folks call me Zach." "Sarah Gentry," she replied cautiously. "And this is Emma." Before Zach could respond, one of his companions approached, a shorter man with a scraggly beard. "Sorry about that, Zach. That new Mustang still got some spirit." The bearded man glanced at Sarah, his eyes narrowing slightly when he noticed the baby. "We don't mean to trouble the lady." "No trouble," Zach replied, his eyes still on Sarah. "Just making acquaintances with Miss Gentry and little Emma here." Sarah shifted uncomfortably under the men's gaze. "I should be going. Thank you again, Mr. Young." "Zach," he corrected. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Gentry." As Sarah hurried away, she could feel his eyes following her. Unlike the stares she'd grown accustomed to, his gaze carried no judgment, only a quiet interest that made her heart beat just a little faster. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sarah had been up since before sunrise, feeding Emma and preparing for her day of work. After her father's death, she'd been forced to find employment, but options for a single mother were severely limited in Nebraska City. She now took in mending and laundry, working from her small room at the boarding house while caring for Emma. Today, she needed to deliver finished work to several homes, an errand she dreaded for the inevitable snubs and whispered comments. But the coins were necessary. Winter was approaching, and Emma would need warmer clothes. She wrapped Emma securely against her chest, gathered the neatly folded laundry into her basket, and ventured out. The first delivery was to the Wilsons, a family whose patriarch owned the lumber mill. Mrs. Wilson opened the door just enough to take the clothes and hand Sarah her payment, not inviting her in as she once would have done, not offering tea or conversation. "The work is satisfactory," Mrs. Wilson said briskly, already closing the door. "Leave the Hendersons' things on their back porch." "Mrs. Henderson isn't receiving visitors today." "Not receiving fallen women," Sarah translated silently but nodded politely. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." As she turned to leave, she noticed a familiar tall figure across the street, leading a horse to the blacksmith. Zach Young was speaking animatedly with the smith, pointing to the horse's shoe. Even at this distance, Sarah could see the easy way he carried himself, the confidence that seemed as natural as breathing. She should have continued on her way, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was simply that he was the first person in months to look at her without contempt. Whatever the reason, when he glanced up and spotted her, Sarah didn't look away. Zach said something to the blacksmith before crossing the street toward her, that same genuine smile lighting his features. "Miss Gentry," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Fine morning." "It is," she agreed, surprised by how her voice didn't tremble as it usually did when addressing strangers these days. He peered into her basket. "Looks like you're keeping busy." "I do laundry and mending," she explained, then added defensively, "honest work." "The most honorable kind," he agreed, no hint of mockery in his tone. His eyes softened as he glanced at Emma's sleeping face. "How old is your little lady?" 6 months, Sarah replied, waiting for the inevitable questions that would follow questions about a husband, about her situation. Instead, he simply nodded. "Good age. Getting to know the world but still small enough to hold close." He reached out a tentative finger which Emma instinctively grasped in her sleep. His face broke into a wide grin. "Strong grip. She'll be riding horses before you know it." Sarah couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "I'm not sure I could afford a pony, Mr. Young." "Zach," he reminded her. "And every child deserves a pony at some point." He seemed to hesitate before asking, "Are you heading toward the Hendersons' place?" "I'm going that direction myself." Sarah knew she should decline. Being seen walking with a man, especially a cowboy, would only fuel the town's gossip. But there was something about Zachary Young that made her want to trust him, despite all the lessons she'd learned about trusting too easily. "I am," she admitted. "Mind if I walk with you? Been in the saddle so long my legs could use the stretching." They fell into step together, and Sarah was acutely aware of the stares following them. Zach seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he simply didn't care. "You're not from Nebraska City," Sarah observed, trying to make conversation. "No, madam. Texas originally, but I've been working cattle drives north for a few years now." He adjusted his hat against the morning sun. "Me and the boys just delivered a herd to the railroad in Omaha. Thought we'd rest a spell before heading back south. And you chose Nebraska City to rest." Sarah couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. The town wasn't known for its entertainment. Zach chuckled. "Truth is, one of our horses came up lame and your blacksmith has a good reputation. Figured we'd stay a few days." He glanced at her, looking more fortunate by the minute that decision. Sarah felt a blush creep into her cheeks and quickly changed the subject. "How long have you been a cowboy?" "Since I was 16. My pa ran a small ranch outside of San Antonio. Learned everything from him until he passed. Been working for other outfits since." "I'm sorry about your father," Sarah said softly. Zach nodded his thanks. "Been 7 years now, still miss his advice." He looked at her thoughtfully. "I heard about your father from the blacksmith. He was well respected." "He was," Sarah agreed, the familiar ache of loss squeezing her heart. He would have loved Emma. They had reached the Henderson home, and Sarah hesitated at the gate. "I need to leave these on the back porch." Zach's eyes narrowed slightly. "They expecting you to go around back like a delivery boy?" Sarah looked away. "It's easier this way." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flash of anger that he quickly masked. "I see. Well, would it be too forward of me to ask if I might call on you properly sometime? Perhaps tomorrow afternoon?" Sarah stared at him in shock. No man had called on her since her condition had become known. "Mr. Young, Zach," he corrected automatically. "Zach," she amended. "You don't understand. People in this town, they don't." "I'm not much concerned with what people think, Miss Gentry. I'd like to get to know you and little Emma better, if you'd allow it." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her to protect herself, to avoid giving the town more to gossip about. But the warmth in Zach's blue eyes made her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in a very long time. "I stay at Mrs. Winter's boarding house," she said finally. "We could sit on the front porch if the weather's fine." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "I'll be there at 2 o'clock sharp." True to his word, Zachary Young arrived at precisely 2 o'clock the following day. Sarah, who had been watching nervously from her window, saw him approach on foot, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt under his leather vest. In his hand, he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Winters answered his knock, eyeing the tall cowboy suspiciously. "You're here for Miss Gentry?" she asked, loudly enough for Sarah to hear from the parlor where she waited with Emma. "Yes, madam," Zach replied politely. "She's expecting me." Mrs. Winters sighed heavily. "That girl's reputation is tattered enough without entertaining cowboys on my front porch, but I suppose it's not my place to judge." She stepped aside to let him enter. "The parlor's to your right. Door stays open, mind you." Sarah rose as he entered, suddenly self-conscious in her simple blue dress, one of the few that still fit properly after Emma's birth. She'd spent extra time on her hair, pinning her chestnut curls into a neat arrangement that she hoped appeared respectable. "Miss Gentry," Zach greeted, removing his hat. His eyes took in the sight of her, and the admiration in them made her flush. "Mr. Young," she replied, then smiled slightly. "Zach," he approached, holding out the package. "A small gift for Emma." Surprised, Sarah unwrapped the package to find a beautifully carved wooden rattle, polished smooth with tiny stars and a crescent moon etched into its surface. "I whittled it myself," Zach explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "Not much to do on long cattle drives except carve and tell tall tales." Sarah was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, thank you." She handed it to Emma, who immediately put it in her mouth, making them both laugh. "Would you like to sit on the porch?" "It's quite pleasant today," Sarah suggested, conscious of Mrs. Winters hovering nearby, pretending to dust. They settled into the rocking chairs on the boarding house's modest front porch. Emma contentedly played with her new rattle in Sarah's lap while they talked. Sarah found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Nebraska City, of her father's work as a doctor, and of her mother's early death. Zach spoke of Texas, of cattle drives across the open plains, and of his dreams to someday have a ranch of his own. "My pa left me a little money," he explained. "Been saving everything I earned to add to it. Few more years, I might have enough for a small spread somewhere." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said sincerely, "to have land of your own to build something lasting." Zach nodded. "A man needs roots eventually, can't be drifting forever." His eyes met hers. "What about you? What do you dream of, Sarah Gentry?" The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her hopes rather than her mistakes. I suppose I just want security for Emma, a place where she can grow up without." She trailed off, unwilling to speak the harsh truth aloud. "Without carrying the weight of other people's judgments," Zach finished for her. Sarah nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Yes, people can be mighty quick to condemn what they don't understand," Zach said quietly. "Seen it plenty in my travels." "I made mistakes," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but Emma wasn't one of them." Zach reached over and gently touched her hand, the brief contact sending warmth up her arm. "No child ever is." They were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Porter, walking briskly toward the boarding house. His face darkened when he saw Sarah sitting with the cowboy. "Miss Gentry," he said stiffly, ignoring Zach completely. "I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Winters about next Sunday's church social." "Of course, Reverend," Sarah replied, rising. "I'll fetch her." As she moved to go inside, she heard the Reverend clear his throat pointedly. "I couldn't help but notice you weren't in attendance last Sunday." "Again." Sarah turned slowly. "I wasn't made to feel welcome the last time I attended, Reverend." The older man's lips thinned. "The Lord's house is open to all who truly repent their sins, Miss Gentry." Before Sarah could respond, Zach stood, his considerable height allowing him to look down at the Reverend. "Seems to me the good book has quite a bit to say about casting the first stone, Reverend, and about judging others." Reverend Porter bristled. "I don't believe I was addressing you, sir." "No," Zach agreed amiably, though his eyes had hardened. "You were addressing a lady who, by my observation, has done nothing but work hard to care for her child with dignity despite being treated poorly by those who should know better." The Reverend's face flushed red. "You know nothing of the situation, young man." "I know enough," Zach replied. "And I know that, in my reading of the Scriptures, Christ seemed a sight more concerned with how we treat the vulnerable than with enforcing social proprieties." For a moment, the two men stared at each other. Then the Reverend adjusted his collar and said coldly, "Please inform Mrs. Winters that I called." After he had gone, Sarah looked at Zach with wide eyes. "You shouldn't have done that. He's influential in town." Zach shrugged, settling back into his chair. "Never could abide bullies, especially ones who hide behind the Bible to do their bullying." "Still," Sarah sighed, "he'll make sure everyone knows about your visit now." "Let them know," Zach said simply. "I'm not ashamed to be seen with you and Emma." The words, so plainly spoken, made Sarah's eyes fill with unexpected tears. She blinked them away quickly, embarrassed by her emotional response. Zach seemed to understand without her explaining. Sometimes it's the simple kindnesses that hit hardest when you've gone without them. Yes, Sarah agreed softly. That's exactly it. Over the next 2 weeks, Zach became a regular visitor at the boarding house. He called every other afternoon, sometimes bringing small gifts: a ribbon for Sarah's hair, a tiny wooden horse for Emma, fresh apples from the orchard outside town. They would sit on the porch when weather permitted or in the parlor under Mrs. Winter's watchful eye when it didn't. To Sarah's surprise, Mrs. Winters gradually warmed to Zach. His respectful manners and obvious admiration for Sarah seemed to soften the older woman's initial suspicions. "That young man has proper intentions, I believe," Mrs. Winters remarked one evening after Zach had left. "Not like some cowboys who blow through town." Sarah wasn't sure what Zach's intentions were exactly, but she found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd trusted a man's charming words once before, with consequences that had altered her life forever. Yet Zach was different. He never pushed for more than her company. He treated Emma with genuine affection, often holding her while they talked, seemingly unconcerned that the child wasn't his blood. And most importantly, he never seemed embarrassed to be seen with Sarah in public. When Zach invited her to join him for dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest establishment in Nebraska City, Sarah initially refused. "People will talk," she protested. "People already talk," Zach pointed out. "Might as well give them something worth talking about." So she agreed, arranging for Mrs. Winters to watch Emma for the evening. She wore her best dress, a navy blue garment with modest lace at the collar that she'd altered to fit her post-pregnancy figure, and pinned her hair up in a style she hadn't attempted since before Emma's birth. The restaurant fell momentarily silent when they entered together, but Zach placed his hand gently at the small of her back and guided her to a table as if he didn't notice the stares. He held her chair, ordered wine, and throughout dinner engaged her in conversation that made her laugh for what felt like the first time in ages. "You know what I think," he said as they lingered over coffee. "I think this town doesn't deserve you, Sarah Gentry." She looked down at her cup. "This is my home. It's all I've known." "Home shouldn't make you feel small," Zach replied. "It should make you feel whole." As they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Sarah found herself wondering what it would be like to make a new home somewhere else, somewhere people didn't know her history, somewhere she could start fresh, with someone like Zach by her side. The thought both exhilarated and terrified her. At the boarding house steps, Zach took her hand in his. "I've enjoyed every minute with you, Sarah." "As have I," she admitted. He hesitated, then said, "I need to ride to Omaha tomorrow on business. I'll be gone 3 days." "Oh." Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. "Safe travels, then." "When I return," Zach continued, his eyes intent on hers, "there's something important I'd like to discuss with you." Sarah's heart fluttered. "What sort of something?" He smiled, lifting her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. The sort of something a man should ask properly, with his thoughts collected and his intentions clear. That night, Sarah barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Zach planning to propose? They had known each other less than a month, yet she couldn't deny the connection between them. Still, marriage was a solemn commitment, one she wouldn't enter lightly, especially with Emma's future to consider. The next 3 days passed slowly. Sarah went about her work, trying not to count the hours until Zach's return. On the second day, she was delivering clean laundry to the mercantile when she overheard 2 women talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear about that cowboy who's been courting the Gentry girl?" one whispered. "Mary at the hotel says he's been asking all over town about her situation." "Probably just curious about the scandal," the other replied. "Men like that don't marry fallen women. They just take advantage until they move on." Sarah's cheeks burned as she quickly gathered her basket and left, their words echoing in her mind. Was Zach merely curious about her past? Was his kindness simply a prelude to taking advantage of her vulnerable position? By the time Zach returned, Sarah had worked herself into a state of nervous suspicion. When he called at the boarding house that evening, she met him on the porch with Emma in her arms, a protective barrier between them. "You're back," she said stiffly. Zach studied her face, his smile fading. "Something's wrong." "I heard you've been asking questions about me around town," Sarah said, getting straight to the point. "About my situation." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Ah, news travels fast in small towns." "Why?" Sarah demanded. "If you wanted to know about my past, you could have asked me directly." Zach removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "You're right, I should have." He gestured to the rocking chair. "May I sit? I'd like to explain." Sarah nodded reluctantly, taking the chair opposite him. Emma settled on her lap. "I wasn't asking about your past out of idle curiosity, Sarah," Zach began. "I was trying to understand what kind of community this is, how deeply rooted the prejudices run." He leaned forward. "Because what I wanted to discuss with you involves asking if you'd consider leaving Nebraska City." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Leaving?" "I purchased land while I was in Omaha," Zach explained. 300 acres along the Platte River, about a day's ride west of here. Good water, good grass, enough timber for building. The beginnings of the ranch I've been saving for." "That's wonderful," Sarah said, genuinely happy for him despite her confusion. "But what does that have to do with me?" Zach met her eyes directly. "I'm asking if you and Emma would consider coming with me as my wife and daughter." Sarah's breath caught. "Your daughter?" "Yes," Zach said simply. "I know I'm not Emma's blood father, but I'd be proud to be the father who raises her, who teaches her to ride and read and face the world with courage just like her mother does." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "You can't mean that. You barely know us." "I know enough," Zach insisted gently. "I know you're the strongest woman I've ever met. I know Emma has your same spirit. I know that when I'm with you both, I feel like I've found something I didn't even realize I was searching for." He reached for her hand. "I'm not asking out of pity, Sarah. I'm asking because I've fallen in love with you, with both of you." Sarah's heart pounded. "People will talk. They'll say you married a woman with a—" "Let them talk," Zach interrupted. "Where we're going will be judged by how we live our lives going forward, not by what happened before we met." He squeezed her hand. "I'm not saying it will be easy. Building a ranch from nothing is hard work, but we'd be building it together, for Emma, for any other children that might come along, for us." Emma chose that moment to reach out toward Zach, babbling happily. Almost automatically, Sarah transferred the baby to his arms, watching how naturally he held her. "She trusts you," Sarah whispered. "Smart girl," Zach replied with a smile. "Gets that from her mama." Sarah took a deep breath. "I need time to think, Zach. This isn't just about me. It's about Emma's future, too." "Of course," he agreed. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." For 3 days, Sarah wrestled with her decision. She made pro and con lists, she prayed, she even consulted Mrs. Winters, who surprised her with her response. "Girl, in my 70 years, I've learned one thing for certain," the older woman said firmly. "When love and respect come together in the same man, you don't question the timing, you thank the good Lord and move forward." Still, Sarah hesitated. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked to her father's grave in the town cemetery, Emma bundled against the November chill. "What would you advise, Papa?" she whispered, placing wildflowers on the simple stone. Is it foolish to trust again? To believe that someone could love us both without reservation, as if in answer, Emma giggled, reaching towards something behind Sarah. She turned to find Zach standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said softly. "Mrs. Winters said I might find you here." "It's all right," Sarah replied. "I was just asking my father's advice." Zach nodded solemnly. "A wise man to consult." "He would have liked you," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty of this knowledge. "He always valued honesty and kindness above social standing." "High praise," Zach replied. "I would have liked to know him." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Sarah spoke again. "When would we leave if I said yes?" Hope flickered in Zach's eyes. "I've purchased supplies and a wagon. We could leave as soon as you're ready. Before the heavy snows come." Sarah looked around at the town that had been her home her entire life, the place where she'd once been respected, then shunned, where Emma had been born but might never be fully accepted. "And our home, on your land, we'd start with a cabin," Zach explained. "Not fancy but solid. I've been talking with the lumber merchant about materials. Come spring, we could begin building something more permanent." He stepped closer. "Sarah, whatever you decide, I want you to know that my feelings won't change. If you need more time, we can wait until spring." Sarah looked down at Emma, then back at the man standing before her, a man who had shown nothing but respect and genuine care for both of them from the moment they met. "I don't need more time," she said finally. "My answer is yes." The joy that transformed Zach's face made Sarah's heart soar. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, wrapping his arms around both her and Emma in a gentle embrace. "You've made me the happiest man in Nebraska territory," he whispered. 2 days later, they were married in a simple ceremony performed by a justice of the peace in the neighboring town of Syracuse. Mrs. Winters attended as witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as Sarah and Zach exchanged vows. Emma, dressed in a new gown Sarah had sewn for the occasion, watched wide-eyed from Mrs. Winters' arms. "You may kiss your bride," the justice announced when the formalities were complete. Zach's lips met Sarah's in a tender kiss that held the promise of many more to come. When they parted, he gently took Emma from Mrs. Winters, holding her between them. "Hello, my daughter," he said softly, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. Emma responded by grabbing his nose, making them all laugh. They left Nebraska City the following morning. The wagon was loaded with Sarah's few possessions, supplies for the journey, and building materials for their new home. Word of their marriage and departure had spread quickly through town, but few people came to see them off. Mrs. Winters hugged Sarah tightly, pressing a small package into her hands. "A wedding gift," she explained. "Nothing fancy, just some seeds from my garden for your new home." Sarah blinked back tears. "Thank you for everything." As they passed the town limits, Sarah looked back one last time at the place that had been both haven and prison for her. She felt no regret, only a growing sense of anticipation for what lay ahead. The journey to their land took a full day, the wagon moving slowly over rutted trails. Emma was remarkably good-natured throughout the trip, fascinated by the changing scenery and lulled to sleep by the wagon's steady motion. As the sun began to set, Zach pointed ahead to where the land sloped gently toward the river. "There it is," he said proudly, "our home." Sarah took in the sweeping vista, the wide, meandering river, the golden grasses of the valley, the stands of cottonwood trees that would provide shelter and building material. It was beautiful in its wild, untamed way. "It's perfect," she said truthfully. They made camp by the river that night, sleeping under the stars. Zach had purchased a sturdy tent, which he set up for Sarah and Emma while he slept near the fire. Even as husband and wife, he was careful to respect her need for time to adjust to their new relationship. The next morning, Zach showed Sarah the site he had chosen for their cabin, a level spot with views of both the river and the rolling hills beyond, sheltered by a grove of trees that would block the worst of the winter winds. "What do you think?" he asked, clearly eager for her approval. Sarah walked the area, imagining their future home. "It's a good spot," she agreed. "Though we might want to face the door east to catch the morning sun." Zach grinned. "East it is." They worked together to establish their homestead. While Zach began constructing the cabin, Sarah set up a more permanent camp, organized their supplies, and cared for Emma. Each day brought new challenges and unexpected joys as they learned to function as a family. The first snow fell before the cabin was fully complete, but they had managed to enclose the walls and roof. They moved in with only a dirt floor and oiled paper covering the window openings. But to Sarah, it felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since her father's death. Their first night in the cabin, after Emma was asleep in the cradle Zach had crafted for her, he approached Sarah hesitantly. "I know this isn't the wedding night a woman dreams of," he said, gesturing to their rustic surroundings. "And I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, we can wait until you're ready." Sarah reached up to touch his face, his beard rougher and fuller now after weeks of working outdoors. "You've been so patient with me, Zach, with us." "I'd wait forever if that's what you needed," he said simply. Sarah stood on tiptoe and kissed him, their first real kiss since their wedding day. "I don't want to wait anymore." That night, in the shelter of their half-finished cabin with the snow falling softly outside, Sarah discovered what love could be between a man and woman who truly respected each other. Zach's tenderness and consideration moved her to tears, and for the first time, she understood that physical intimacy could be an expression of deep emotional connection rather than a means to an end. As winter settled over the plains, the young family fell into a comfortable rhythm. Zach continued working on the cabin whenever weather permitted, adding a proper floor, real glass windows ordered from Omaha, and sturdy furniture he built himself. Sarah created a home from their simple surroundings, sewing curtains from fabric they'd brought from town, arranging their few possessions to maximum effect, and experimenting with recipes using their stored provisions. Emma thrived in their new environment. She began crawling, then pulling herself up on furniture, exploring their small cabin with determined curiosity. Zach doted on her, carving toys, singing her to sleep with Cowboy's songs, and including her in his daily activities whenever possible. "She's going to be riding before she walks at this rate," Sarah laughed one evening as she watched Zach bouncing Emma on his knee, pretending she was on horseback. "A proper cowgirl needs to start young," Zach replied with a wink. In February, during a particularly harsh blizzard that kept them housebound for 3 days, Sarah confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting a child. She waited until Emma was napping before sharing the news with Zach. "Really?" he asked, his face lighting up with wonder. "You're certain?" Sarah nodded, smiling at his reaction. "The baby should arrive in late summer." Zach whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet in a gentle spin before setting her down and kissing her soundly. "A baby," he marveled, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though his reaction made the question almost unnecessary. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Zach confirmed. He glanced at Emma's sleeping form. "Think she'll mind having a little brother or sister?" "I think she'll be a wonderful big sister," Sarah replied. She hesitated before adding, "Does it matter to you that Emma isn't, that she's not?" Zach placed a finger gently against her lips. Emma is my daughter in every way that matters. This new little one won't change that. He cupped her face in his hands. I love our family exactly as it is and exactly as it will be. Spring brought new life to their land. Green shoots pushed through the soil, the river ran full with melting snow from the mountains, and wildlife returned in abundance. Zach purchased cattle, the beginning of their herd, and 2 horses. He taught Sarah to ride, something she'd never learned growing up in town. Their nearest neighbors, the Caldwell family, lived 5 miles away. They had been cautiously welcoming when Zach and Sarah first arrived, but as spring progressed, the families began to visit back and forth. The Caldwells had 3 children, and their eldest daughter, 12-year-old Beth, was enchanted with Emma. Your little girl is just the sweetest thing, Mrs. Caldwell remarked during one visit, watching as Beth played with Emma on a quilt spread in the grass. You've done a fine job with her, especially being on your own at the start. Sarah tensed, waiting for the judgment that usually followed such observations. Instead, Mrs. Caldwell continued thoughtfully, can't have been easy. My sister found herself in a similar situation some years back. City folks can be mighty cruel about such things. Yes, Sarah agreed cautiously. They can be. Mrs. Caldwell patted her hand. Out here, we tend to worry more about whether you can survive the winters and help at harvest than about what happened before you arrived. Life's too short and neighbors too few for petty judgments. Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she still carried begin to lift. Thank you for that. Nothing to thank me for, Mrs. Caldwell replied matter-of-factly. Now, when's that new baby due? August, you said. We'll need to organize a quilting bee before then. By early summer, their homestead had transformed. The cabin was finished, with a small front porch where Sarah liked to sit in the evenings. A kitchen garden flourished near the house, providing fresh vegetables for their table. Zach had constructed a sturdy barn and corral for the livestock, and had broken ground for what would eventually become the main ranch house, once their herd and family grew larger. Emma was walking now, toddling after Zach whenever he was in sight, her chubby legs carrying her on determined expeditions around the yard. She called him Papa, her first real word, and the sound never failed to bring a look of pure joy to Zach's face. In late August, as the prairie grasses turned golden under the hot sun, Sarah went into labor. Mrs. Caldwell came to assist, bringing Beth to help care for Emma. After 14 hours, Sarah gave birth to a healthy son, whom they named William Zachary Young after both his grandfathers. He's perfect, Zach whispered, cradling his newborn son with tears in his eyes. Just like his mama. And his sister, Sarah added, watching as Emma peered curiously at the baby from her perch on the bed beside Sarah. Baby, Emma declared, reaching out to touch her brother's tiny fingers. That's right, sweet pea, Zach said, including Emma in their circle. Your baby brother. You're going to help Mama and Papa take care of him, aren't you? Emma nodded solemnly, clearly taking this new responsibility very seriously. As autumn painted the landscape in rich hues of amber and crimson, the Young family celebrated their first full year on their land. They hosted a harvest gathering for the handful of families that lived within traveling distance, sharing food, music, and the community they had all chosen by settling in this remote but beautiful place. Late that night, after their guests had departed and the children were asleep, Sarah and Zach sat on their porch, wrapped in a quilt against the evening chill. Happy? Zach asked, his arm around her shoulders. Sarah looked out at their land, at the home they had built together, at the future they were creating. More than I ever dreamed possible, she replied honestly. A year ago, I couldn't imagine being accepted anywhere, having a family that wasn't shadowed by shame. Zach pressed a kiss to her temple. You never had anything to be ashamed of, Sarah. Some people just need wider horizons to see clearly. Like you, she said, turning to look into his eyes. You really saw me from the first moment. Best thing I ever did was let that horse get away from me in Nebraska City, Zach chuckled. Brought me right to you and Emma. And now we have Will too, Sarah mused, thinking of their sleeping son, our family. The beginning of it, anyway, Zach replied with a grin. I was thinking maybe we should aim for at least 4 or 5 young-uns to help run this ranch properly. Sarah laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. Let's get these 2 raised a bit more before we start planning the next ones. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of their land, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass, the gentle rush of the river that had become the heartbeat of their home. I love you, Sarah Young, Zach said softly. And I love you, she replied, the words coming as naturally as breathing. Thank you for making us a family. Over the years that followed, the Young ranch prospered, growing from its humble beginnings into one of the most successful operations in the region. Their family expanded to a daughter, Grace, joined them 2 years after Will's birth, followed by twins Michael and Matthew 3 years later. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's spirit and her father's love of the land. Though she knew the story of her birth, Sarah and Zach had always been honest with their children. She never felt anything but completely part of the family. Zach had been the only father she'd ever known, and his love for his firstborn daughter was evident to everyone who knew them. When Emma was 18, a young rancher from a neighboring property began calling on her. Sarah watched history repeat itself in the most beautiful way as her daughter fell in love, this time with the full blessing of her family and community. On Emma's wedding day, Zach walked her proudly down the aisle they had created in the front yard of what was now a sprawling ranch house. As he placed her hand in her groom's, Sarah saw tears in his eyes. Later, as they watched the young couple's first dance, Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder. Penny for your thoughts, Cowboy. Zach smiled, his hair now streaked with silver but his blue eyes as bright as ever. Just thinking about that day in Nebraska City. How close I came to never knowing any of this. He gestured to their family gathered around them, their children, the friends who had become extended family, the community they had helped build. We've been blessed, Sarah agreed. You and Emma were my first blessing, Zach said, taking her hand in his. Everything good in my life started the moment I met you both. Sarah squeezed his hand, thinking of the journey that had brought them here from shame and isolation to love and belonging. They had built not just a ranch but a legacy of acceptance and second chances that would outlive them both. No, she corrected gently. Everything good started when you chose to see beyond what others saw, when you called us both family before we even were. Zach smiled, leaning down to kiss her tenderly. Best decision I ever made, he whispered against her lips. And as the celebration continued around them, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the end of one road, even one paved with judgment, and pain, could lead to the beginning of a journey more beautiful than she could have ever imagined.